in prepping for this show, Danny, one of the things that you mentioned to me is that you were sort of tracking the shift in public opinion, not only here, but around the world, about the Russia-Ukraine war. And so CNN reported that Zelensky's mixed reception in Washington may be a taste of political storm to come. This was published late last night on CNN. The blue and gold flag draped hero worship of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's last Washington trip, which stirred comparisons to Winston Churchill's wartime stand against Nazism, was a distant memory on Thursday. 9 months later, Zelensky was back in town, and he and his hosts learned some jarring lessons about one another at a moment when a path to ultimate victory in the war against Russia seems increasingly distant. Zelensky got an abrupt preview of how Donald Trump's possible return to power after the 2024 election and how the ex-president's current sway over the ungovernable Republican-led House of Representatives could rupture the multi-billion-dollar lifeline on which Ukraine's survival depends. And far from clearing a new $24 billion administration request to sustain Ukraine's war effort, the chaotic House failed again Thursday to even fund the defense of the United States as a new attempt to pass a military appropriations bill founded against hard-right opposition. For their part, Americans glimpsed the sapping impact of a brutal war on a leader who rallied stunning resistance to a Russian invasion, but also shoulders the burden of months of death and sacrifice forced upon his people. At times, the comic actor turned wartime hero looked exhausted and unsmiling. In a CNN interview, he confessed the personal strain of his furtive life as Russia's top target. And in public appearances, Zelensky's patience sometimes frayed, especially when berating the UN for failing to protect its members from aggression in a U.S. capital that has undergone an ideological shift since he was last here just before Christmas 2022. It now takes more than quoting President FDR and drawing allusions to 9/11 to woo lawmakers. There's also a question of whether Zelensky's relentless efforts to shame the world into action might be reaching the point of diminishing returns. The pugnacious president might think so too, judging by multiple and poignant expressions of gratitude for previous help, as polls show more Americans are skeptical of aid to Ukraine. So I don't know if you got a chance to see either of his two speeches. I watched both, the one for this Security Council and the GA. I didn't watch much of his interaction with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, but from everything I've been hearing, it seems like they were much cooler to him than they were just 1 year ago. You've been tracking this for a while. How have you been tracking the sort of evolution of public opinion?
Well, in globally, during the UN resolution that was pushed forward directly after Russia's so-called invasion of Ukraine, we saw many countries, despite not going along with sanctions in the subsequent months, still voting to condemn Russia around this issue. Now, though, the situation is completely different. First of all, there's not going to be any more UN resolutions to condemn Russia because the war has, gone on and on and on. And it's quite clear that positions have changed. Even if we just look at the G20 summit in New Delhi, the leaders' statement, the leaders' statement that comes out after each G20 summit or during each G20 summit took out the language that said that the G20 condemns Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It took out Russia altogether and said all parties must, come together and resolve the conflict and oppose unilateral intervention or something of the sort. So that in and of itself shows how much global public opinion has changed. And of course, we know that the vast majority of the world outside of the EU and the United States are not going along with sanctions. Even the European Union can't go along with sanctions and have had to get Russian gas and Russian oil through third parties, because if they truly did turn off the spigot with Russia, their economies would collapse. And even despite all of these maneuvers, Germany is in a recession right now, in large part because it has cut itself off from Russia. So public opinion worldwide has changed dramatically. In the United States, there's more and more anger toward the prospects of more aid to Ukraine, which is what is fueling public opinion dips here around the conflict. But still, because of the way polls are manipulated and because of how essentially Europe and the United States has created another kind of 9/11-like situation, many people will at least tacitly oppose what Russia is doing and buy into the propaganda. But I think what's most important is how the mainstream media, as a mouthpiece of the warmongers, of the neocons, of the foreign policy establishment, has changed its tune intensely. I mean, this is a massive shift in a very short period of time. If we just look back at December of 2022, when Zelensky was in Washington, he got a standing ovation. He was able to speak in front of Congress. The Speaker of the House was Nancy Pelosi, all of our favorite politician. She just dressed him down, gave him a coronation. Joe Biden the same. You had AOC. All of them were clapping and talking about how this was the war to end all wars. This is a fight for democracy against autocracy. No more. This time around, Zelensky goes to Washington and he can't even get into a joint session of Congress. There was no session of Congress held for Zelensky this time. Of course, Kevin McCarthy, as the House Speaker now, is in the GOP, and the GOP is trying to politicize the Ukraine conflict for their own purposes, starting to flank toward the notion that it might be time to hold Zelensky accountable, hold Ukraine accountable for all this money that's been spent. And obviously, that's an electoral move. That probably doesn't mean much, but it does show that there is a lot of fatigue, even amongst the foreign policy establishment around this conflict. And it's no wonder why. I mean, look at what is going on. The so-called counteroffensive, which started months late, it was forecasted for like 6 months before it even began. There's going to be a counteroffensive. It's going to end the conflict. Ukraine is going to win it. We're ready to fight. There was all sorts of back and forth between Germany, France, the UK, the United States. How many tanks can we get to Ukraine? How many weapons can we get to them? All culminating to giving M1 Abrams, Leopard 2s, et cetera, to Ukraine so that it could win this counteroffensive. Then it launches in June, and it's been more than 3 months now. And what has happened? Well, there's been over 70,000 Ukrainian armed forces killed in action. 30+% of all of NATO's arsenal provided to Ukraine has been destroyed or captured. And Ukraine hasn't even been able to break through the first line of defense that Russia had fortified, in those like 6 months that they had to prepare for Ukraine's so-called counteroffensive. So it's failed. It's over. There's no going back to, well, we're going to progress and take territory no matter what Antony Blinken says. And so this has created a really chilled mood among Zelensky and Ukraine's NATO masters. They are feeling the fatigue. They know that they can't really supply Ukraine in the way that Ukraine needs to be supplied. Russia's outgunning Ukraine 10-1 in many cases at all levels, whether it's the amount of tanks that are out in the field, whether it's the ammunition and the artillery. Ukraine is just outgunned and it can't make any progress. So now there is a huge mood shift there, and that's going to come with action, because when you hear the mainstream media, for example, The Economist published an article just yesterday saying, well, it's likely that the West's support for Ukraine is going to diminish in the next year. And it's because all we've been hearing now is Ukraine's in a war of attrition, as if that was Ukraine's strategy to begin. Ukraine's entire strategy that NATO had concocted was, we're going to arm them to the teeth so they can take back territory and hopefully facilitate Russia's collapse in doing so. By taking back Donbass, by rolling through, pushing out Russia's military, we can then facilitate a political crisis in Russia. The sanctions were supposed to create an economic crisis, and together that was going to lead to Russia's downfall indirectly. It was all supposed to happen almost like a house of cards. None of it occurred. And so now the opinions are changing, because the United States in the main realizes that this is going to be a years-long project, as most of its proxy wars, most of its wars are. The United States doesn't have the capability anymore and doesn't have the political legitimacy worldwide to get anything done very quickly. Everything is a slow rolling disaster when it comes to its foreign policy. And Ukraine is no different. Ukraine is simply the most intense example of this at this point. And it's not going to go well. I think there was a package announced of like $325 million, pales in comparison to the $24 billion promise that was made by Joe Biden, which Congress, it's not looking like Congress is going to come to that agreement anytime soon. And even if it does, it's going to hold many kinds of stipulations that delay funding, that split it up, and it's not going to be nearly enough for what Ukraine really needs to fight back against Russia. It really is a lost war, and it's astounding to see Zelensky behave the way he does. One of the things that I always talk about, Keaton, is that Zelensky is a puppet unhinged. He doesn't behave like he should. But I was talking to someone earlier about, how back during the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a lot of people believe, well, Saddam, at least those who are critical of U.S. foreign policy, Saddam was our guy. We fed him all these chemical weapons and these weapons, and he was our puppet too. And then he went rogue, and so the United States wanted to take him out. That wasn't really an accurate analysis. Saddam was always kind of independent, and he did take U.S. weapons because there was a conflict with Iran. But at the same time, he was always an Arab nationalist. He was always someone that was simply independent and could at any time decide that the United States really wasn't a friend of Iraq. With Ukraine, Zelensky was bought and paid for many, many years since he came to power in 2019. The United States was funneling billions in support for Ukraine's regime, using the National Endowment for Democracy to cultivate a political class there that would be subservient and servile as they built up a huge military for the first time in Ukraine to conduct this kind of conflict. And at the same time, as the conflict has wore on, Zelensky has become a spoiled actor, for lack of a better analogy. He truly is someone that cannot keep his mouth shut. So now people like Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, Joe Biden, they're all angry. And Kevin McCarthy, for all intents and purposes, it's easy to use this as political leverage. Everyone is angry that Zelensky talks to them like he is the master rather than the servant. He talks to them as, give me more weapons or we're not going to win. If you don't give me more weapons, what's wrong with you? I'm disappointed in you. He will talk like this to his own masters, and that's creating a public relations issue that isn't talked about as much. It probably isn't the primary reason the United States is cooling on this conflict, but it is a significant one. And it's significant because we've seen the musical chairs that have been played on Ukraine's regime of late. Many different people have been ousted, from the defense minister to all of the deputy defense ministers just in the last month. And that is because the United States is looking at Ukraine's regime as a huge liability. It's massively corrupt. It's not effective. And Zelensky, they invested too much in him and they can't get rid of him just yet. But Zelensky is by no means safe. So at any point when if this conflict truly does freeze and there's a lull period, it doesn't mean Zelensky is safe at all. It means that he is probably more unsafe than he's ever been in terms of his position.
Please clap.